Welcome to ChamberLIVE. Today sees the return of our HR forum, which is our specialist group for HR professionals and anyone who has a HR role in their business. The HR forum is sponsored by Forbes Solicitors. They offer a full range of legal services to individuals, commercial clients, and a number of specialist sectors where they excel nationally. The views expressed in this webinar don't necessarily represent the views of the East Lancs Chamber of Commerce, and all facts are believed to be correct at the time of recording, which is the 29th of July 2020. Today we'll hear from Emma Swan, Partner and Head of Commercial Employment at our event sponsors, Forbes Solicitors, and then Andrew Stirrup from AJ Stirrup will take us through the COVID Culture Challenge. We'll introduce Andrew later, so let's get things underway with Emma. Emma is Partner and Head of Commercial Employment at Forbes. She's going to reflect now on the last few months' challenges in employment law and HR as businesses ready themselves for permanent changes to where they work or prepare for a return to the workplace. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you very much, Simon. The last few months have been an immense challenge for businesses, and as Simon said, I'm going to reflect on some of the employment law and HR challenges that we have faced. And partly that's to set the context of the challenges that we're facing in our businesses now from a cultural perspective. So if we start from the beginning, we had lockdown. Whilst a lot of us were expecting it to happen, as we'd seen across Europe and across the world, different countries starting to lock down, it still came as a huge shock to many of us. And in that first Monday evening, when Boris Johnson announced that we were having a lockdown, my team at Forbes experienced a high number of calls from clients asking what that meant for their businesses. Did they have key workers? Did they have essential workers? Did they actually have any work at all to be undertaking? And there was an initial knee-jerk reaction, for want of a better word, from a number of businesses as to whether they actually could continue. And could we help them with restructuring, with making redundancies, with laying people off immediately? And it was very much a challenging time initially. So that's one of the first things that we have to bear in mind. How did we deal with lockdown? How did we communicate with our staff? How did we treat our staff? Because that is going to have repercussions further down the line. The second stage, as it were, in the pandemic was furlough. Furlough was announced, the coronavirus job retention scheme. And this was a lifeline to many businesses. Even those businesses that were managing to work out of sorts through the initial lockdown, it still meant that in the long term, the furlough scheme was going to help them protect some of the cash flow to enable them to secure jobs for longer. But what impact does that have on our workforces? So for some businesses, they were able to furlough pretty much everybody. So everybody was in the same boat. But we also saw many workforces that then became split. And we had some people who were put on furlough, some people who were kept working. So some people were still getting 100% wages, but working for it, and others were getting 80% and not having to work. So we then have this kind of almost imbalance where people who are in work are starting to think, well, I'm only being paid 20% more, but I'm having to work 100%. And those at home thinking, oh, I'm not in work. What does that mean for me? Does that mean that I am unlikely to have a job at the end of the furlough scheme? So it almost creates what we often refer to as a two-tier workforce that creates a lot of issues there. And again, how did business communicate this? Did businesses continue communicating with their furloughed staff, offering the reassurances, reaching out to them? Did they continue to communicate with those who were in work? Were they reassuring them, thanking them for all their hard work, making sure that they were seeing some of the benefits of being kept in work without undermining any business decisions that may have to then be made long-term for redundancies? Thirdly, we have then seen the introduction of the flexible furlough scheme. And again, this is another great initiative in my view from the government. Businesses were crying out for this when the furlough scheme was first announced, because the furlough scheme, as we all know now, meant that whilst you had businesses putting individuals onto furlough to safeguard jobs and to give a provision of some wages, it also meant that individuals weren't able to work, and some businesses did need some employees doing some work in order to keep the business ticking over. So with the introduction of the flexible furlough scheme, we have seen that opportunity for businesses to continue to protect some cash flow, but also start generating more cash from employees who are now working on the flexible furlough. But again, it raises the question for that split workforce as to why is that person being brought in on flexible furlough and I'm still not coming into work? Does this mean that their job's going to be okay and mine isn't? So again, it's starting to undermine that culture, that cohesive, collaborative nature that you may have had in your teams beforehand. And whilst businesses will hopefully have been operating the furlough scheme and the flexible furlough scheme in line with the law and the guidance that we're receiving and advice that's been shared by Forbes and other legal providers, it doesn't take away from the fact that this is going to have a cultural impact. We can all follow the law, but still have a massive impact on our employee relations and our culture. So again, how were we communicating during that flexible furlough being introduced? The fourth challenge has been the easing of lockdown. One of the biggest questions that my team were facing when we started easing lockdown and having people coming back in was with the test and trace. And his work colleague is in work, they suddenly test positive for COVID. They have been working in close proximity, albeit with as much PPE and social distancing as possible for a job. But the test and trace has meant that that colleague, their teammates are then being required to self-isolate as well. And that within a business is hugely disruptive. You're going to want to follow the law. You're going to ensure that your staff are then self-isolating through the track and trace system. But again, how have you communicated with them? How have you reassured them that their job is there? What are they going to get paid? Are you paying them for sick pay when they're not poorly? Are you putting them on unpaid leave because they're unable to work? Can you afford not to pay them to continue that employee relationship with them and make sure that they're positive about coming back? And also, can you afford to do that? What you've also got to bear in mind, and what we have been seeing, is resentment amongst colleagues. That person went to a party at the weekend, now they've come down with COVID, and the rest of us have to stay off for 2 weeks. So again, it's really important to understand the implications that imposing some of these legal obligations ultimately have on the relationships that we have with our staff and between our colleagues. This week's challenge, I'm sure everybody has had an opportunity to talk about this, is the imposition of self-isolation for when we're coming back from holiday from certain countries. Within our business, we have people on holiday in Spain. It's a very common place to have employees going to. And I suspect that a lot of you who are joining us this morning will have either already faced this problem and these questions, or over the next month or two are going to have staff who have booked to go on holidays. What are you going to do about that? It is really important that you think carefully now what your policy is going to be. Are you going to make sure that you are monitoring where people are going on holiday, where they are coming back from? Are you going to pay them if they're having to self-isolate, even if they don't have any symptoms of it? Can you enable them to work from home, even if they had returned to the workplace? Or is it a case of you're not going to pay them if they can't come into work? How are you going to deal with that from an employee relations perspective? Now, on some of the legal implications, I'm actually appearing on Radio BBC Lancashire tomorrow morning. If you'd like to tune in, 7:45 till 8 o'clock in the morning, and I'm taking questions. So please feel free to throw a few left field questions at me on holiday pay and what have you. But the final phase, I suppose, for today that I wanted to talk about is as we return to the workplace. Many businesses are now starting to plan for people to come back, even if they've been working from home. The rhetoric from Boris Johnson and the government is no longer work from home where you can, but return to the workplace if you can. Now, whether we agree with that or not, it's something that businesses are starting to gear up. And what we need to start thinking about is, if you've had employees working from home or perhaps shielding, how do you bring them back into the workplace? How do they feel about the prospect of returning to the workplace? You are likely to have a number of people who are anxious about it, who are stressed. They may have been suffering from depression. And there's a whole host of reasons for those things. It may be that people have lost people during the pandemic and are still grieving. It may be that people have been very poorly themselves and are worried about going back into the workplace because of long-term health issues that they may now have. It may be that people are concerned about catching COVID and what that will mean either for themselves, their own health, or for the people that they go home to each evening. Some of these individuals will amount to disabled people for the Equality Act purposes. So what we have to be very mindful of is that for those individuals, we have to make sure that we adhere to the duty to make reasonable adjustments, which is a legal obligation. And it may well be that if you have been able to allow those people to work from home, that a reasonable adjustment is to allow them to continue to do so during the pandemic. Even if you have someone who isn't disabled, it is really important to communicate with them, to ask them why they're concerned, what is it that they are worrying about, and also talk them through what you are doing. All businesses, if they haven't done already, should have carried out a risk assessment, and they should have put together a policy with that risk assessment. Sharing that, communicating that with your staff is absolutely key to ensuring that you are taking the right steps to reassure them as to why they can come back. Perhaps you can talk to them about having a trial period coming into work, or just letting them come in out of hours to see what measures you have already put into place. But it's really important to be bearing that in mind as we come to more people coming back. It's also really important to bear in mind that colleagues haven't seen each other for a long time. What could once have been really collaborative, honest, open teams that had a lot of fun together may simply not be the same when they come back. And it's really important that you start thinking about that now as well. Now, that's the end of my slot, but a little bit of a reflection. I will take questions, I think, at the end, because I think there are probably lots of things that will come out of Andrew's section. But passing over to Andrew for his section.
Thanks, Emma. We'll include Emma's contact details in our post-event email, so if anyone wishes to contact her directly with specific queries, I'm sure she'll be delighted to respond. Now, on to our next speaker, Andrew Stirrup. He helps leaders to lead with a fresh perspective and is the founder and lead consultant of AJ Stirrup. He works with businesses of all shapes and sizes, from SMEs to multinational companies and in elite sport as well. His passion lies in his belief that your people are your greatest asset and deserve to be your greatest competitive advantage too. AJ Stirrup deliver cultural and behavioural change programs to inspire you and your people to create the high performance culture that you really want. Time to welcome our speaker for today, Andrew Stirrup. Over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me. And it's great to be here with Emma from Forbes as well, who I know well from the time I've spent with them in the past as a client. So I've entitled today's presentation as What's Possible, and it's in relation to the COVID Culture Challenge. So before we progress, it would be really helpful to know which of the following best describes your role. Okay, so it appears that we've got people who are managers and some business owners and also some leaders. We haven't got any team leaders, but essentially this session is all about thinking about the opportunities for leaders and managers during the coronavirus crisis in relation to your business's culture. So here we see a Petri dish in the middle. This is where we are now. And we had life before now, which was basically before coronavirus. And then everyone's talking about the virus disappearing. And in actual fact, it may not disappear. And it's all about sort of life after, or when it's over. And it certainly is going to improve, but actually we're not really sure of what will happen. And that's giving us lots of things to think about, and is basically presenting leaders and managers with new challenges, new opportunities. So essentially it's all about what are we going to do as we move forward. So here, if we have a building and we have a room. Now, if you'd just like to mention some of the things in the chat that you see when you see this room. So what do you see? Let's play Say What You See. Okay, so we've got a boardroom, a meeting room, clinical, okay, cold. Yeah, okay, so what's it missing? There we go, people. So people really are the difference in all of this process. So Simon mentioned in the introduction that I'm passionate about helping people to be the best that they can be, and that they are your organization's greatest asset. And that's very true. But here, what you've got essentially is a room full of stuff. It only becomes a meeting room or a boardroom when you introduce people into it. And that's the same for any business, no matter how large or small. So the moment that you actually have somebody doing something and they're actually making some money from doing that, it becomes a business, but it can't happen without a person. So essentially what we need to think about is, what does that really mean from the point of view of our culture? Because our culture is nothing more than a collection of habits, and it's the habits of our people. So here we are. This is the man. This is the pole with soul. So when we look at the boardroom, it sounded soulless. It sounded clinical. This man had a lot of soul, but he was also a pole. So we're now going to move on to the next pole. And if you could answer the following question, which is, which of the following are the biggest challenges an organisation faces when shaping its culture? So it's interesting that the number one answer was no strong strategic narrative. And then obviously we've got some interesting answers around double standards from leaders and the fear of change. And people, basically, it's how do we get people to join the journey, which obviously links to encouraging people to change, or people not really seeing the need for change. Now, all of these statements are things that we could have said at any time in our timeline as business owners or leaders. This was something which was around before coronavirus. So it's important that we actually keep this in mind, because these things aren't going to go away. It's the context that is actually changing. So that's something that we're always going to be thinking about. Now, one of the things that we can look at are the 4 key enablers. So essentially, this was from a survey and some information that was written in 2012. And the 4 key enablers around employee engagement are that you've got to have a strong strategic narrative. So it's really important that your leaders are visible, that they basically are empowering others to deliver the strong strategic narrative about the business. And essentially everyone knows where they've come from and where they're going. Now, in order to do that, you've got to have engaging managers. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean having managers that solely are able to engage their teams. Of course it's that, but actually it's how are the leadership going to actually engage with those managers too, to make sure that the focus is there, so that basically they can give their people the right scope to do what needs to be done. And it's about treating people as individuals. And some of the things that Emma was talking about earlier really, really hone in on that. And then also it's about coaching and stretching. Now, right now, we've got to really think about how we can actually go about doing this when people's working environments and personal needs are different, because actually people are being stretched in different ways, irrespective of their job. So we've actually got to help them in more ways than we did do previously. And then we've got the employee voice. Now, Steve Smith has very kindly joined us on the call. He's going to speak to you shortly. And basically, the employee voice is all about making sure that we give people the opportunity to share how they're feeling about the organisation. And it's about reinforcing and challenging the views between functions. And also it's a case of involving and listening to people. And it's inviting them to contribute with their experience. And this is something which is hugely important right now. It was important pre-COVID, but now it's becoming even more important. And I thought it was interesting listening to Emma, because hidden inside a lot of the things that she was talking about was the importance of communication. And communication has got to keep going. It's got to be little and often, regular, different types of communication. Now, finally, you've got organisational integrity. This is something I'd like to talk about today because values are really central to everything that's great in a business. Many businesses don't appreciate that, but those that have spent time and money and effort in creating their values with their people, but then actually making sure that they believe in those values and live and breathe them, they actually create an organisational integrity. In other words, there's not a difference between what we say and what we do. There's no gap. It is what you see, and it matches what you might see on the wall or on the poster which describes the values. And it's all about keeping promises. Now, right now, it's quite difficult for organisations to keep promises because they're not necessarily sure of the future, but there is a way that we can go about doing that. So I'm just going to hand over to Steve now. Hopefully, Steve, your technology is working better than mine. And you could just quickly talk through this slide, please. I'm conscious that we're behind on time.
Of course. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you for allowing me a cameo appearance.
You're very welcome.
I like the cameo stuff, and I wasn't expecting it. So we've done a survey. We did a returning to work survey through Neweg and all the Neweg members. And we ended up with about, just over 8,000 responses. So a lot of data that we're continuing to sort of monitor real time, and it's telling us some really interesting things. So I'm a data guy, but I also like to look at data in sort of real human issues. And the first thing that really sort of jumped out at me is that people are more uncomfortable returning to work. And that figure is increasing. As more and more people are coming back into work, we're finding that more and more people are becoming uncomfortable. So it's 43% of people are uncomfortable against 39% of people. So there's not much in it, but more people are telling us that we're uncomfortable and we don't feel safe in coming back to work. You know, that's quite a worry for me. And it suggests that we've not got the returning to work stuff right, especially now we're seeing that, you know, the people that are coming back are saying that it's increasingly becoming more and more uncomfortable to come back to work. And then the other one that I look at, and it sort of it fills me with sadness really, is that it's 1 in 5 people think things are going to get worse for them personally. You know, it doesn't sound a massive figure, but you know, 1 in 5 people who work with us. So these are Northwest people, real human beings that are worried about losing the jobs, losing the livelihood, and they don't feel safe. So, you know, those two things really sort of stand out for me. And there's lots of other aspects as well. And I'm not going to take up too much more of your time, Andrew, because I know you've got loads of stuff to cover. But if anybody wants to see copies of the full piece, just either drop me a line in chat or send me an email, and I'm happy to share all that with you, because it's real information. It's Northwest based. It's what's happening right now today, and it's frightening. Back to you, Andrew.
That's great. Thanks, Steve. A couple of people have asked in the chat whether or not we can share the PowerPoint slide deck. The answer to that is yes, of course. We'll make sure that's made available. And Steve, thank you for offering that to people too. I know you're doing some great work in some other areas as well on something that you're calling navigating the nonsense, which I guess is helping people to get into the guts of all of this stuff, as you say. So thank you for that. So moving swiftly on, hopefully. Does anybody know who this is? This is your second famous poll. No pun intended. Does anyone know? Because I had no idea about this fact. This is Marie Curie, who actually was Polish. So we're going to have another poll now. And so which one of the following are most important to you right now? Okay, so you'd like to just have a quick look at the results and just see what you've seen, or what you've said. Sorry, helping your leaders to lead and manage effectively. That's an interesting one. Matching the business's needs with your employees' needs. Very interesting. Another one is defining a new long-term way of working. We've got some talk about organisational structure as well, and so on. So it's interesting, isn't it? This is all about what this all points back towards is communication and transparency. Because in order for us to be able to effectively find a solution or to help people and matching those needs, we've actually got to have a better level of understanding And actually, we've got that works two ways, because a relationship always works two ways. It's bound to come out of asking questions and listening. So as part of that, when we think about the traditional approach, when we're looking at a business and trying to solve or support a business, we're always looking at the results, and we're thinking about the performance of the business. And around that, we've got the activities and the process, which of course is all very, very important. And then we've got the skills and the behaviour. And those are all the things that we see on the surface. They're just the tip of the iceberg. But what actually is happening underneath is far, far more important. So we've got to think about what are the beliefs and the values of people. And particularly, we've got to consider what are people's beliefs about this current situation, because that is actually completely challenging their current value set, how they feel about what they do, where they work, who they work with. All these sorts of things start to come into play in a different way. And actually what it does is underneath that, it's really challenging our attitudes and our motivation to do things. And we're either going to be sort of on the negative pole or on the positive pole. We might even just be in the middle. But the point is that different people in different places. And the only way that we can actually address this is by genuinely thinking about the situation and causing people to think about it. Not just navel gazing for thinking's sake, but actually thinking that's going to help us to actually establish what that belief is and then try and fix it or try and find a solution. And actually what we've got to realize is that our habits basically define us too, which I'm going to come to later. So many of us are looking for a solution. Many business owners are looking for a solution. Many of you as managers are looking for a solution in order to be able to maybe find a more effective way of working with your people. Many of you probably are trying to find new ways of trying to make that happen. And ultimately, it's about finding clarity and having some confidence and belief in what you're doing, because sometimes it's exasperating. Now, this is a little process. It's not really a process as such, because it's essentially just some pillars, really, of what make a really great high-performing team, and also what make high-performing organisations, because a team is essentially two people or more. But this could be a department, it could be the overall business. And the first thing that we've really got to look at and examine is our quest. So many of you, I guess, have heard the story about placing the man on the moon, when President Kennedy went to NASA and was speaking to the janitor, and the janitor basically, when he was asked, "What are you doing?" he said, "I'm putting a man on the moon." Well, it's a very famous story. Lots of us have heard it, and it's used lots and lots of times, but it's perfect because the janitor actually understood the role that he played. Now, pre-COVID, some businesses, not all, but many businesses who've done work in this area knew what that was, and they were able to articulate it to their people. So their people felt like they had a sense of purpose, and they felt like they understood what they were doing and the reason that they were doing it for. Now, that hasn't gone away. It's back to the 4 key enablers. Those 4 things are still going to exist now. It's just how we actually execute them. So one of the things that businesses that are doing well at the moment are doing is they're really very much looking at their purpose. They're revisiting what their purpose is. What is it that makes them stand out, really? What is it that what's their overarching reason for being? Because some businesses are actually realizing that they need to change that quite dramatically. So first point is right now, ask yourself, even if you're managing a team, because I notice quite a few managers on the call, ask yourself, how clear are your team on what they feel their purpose is right now? And how are you the leader of that? Because there's some scope there to, even if it's uncertain, to agree that with them, to involve them in that. And at a corporate level or at a more organizational level, it's very much going to be about us deciding, is our purpose fit for purpose? Do we need to change it? And if so, if you're going to do that, the opportunity lies in involving your people in that process. This is not something that you just do in the boardroom and leave for everybody else. Now, the next part is ethos. Now, ethos literally means character and spirit. And really, if you think about it, that's our values. And our behaviours are an expression of our values. And I had a conversation with somebody in the very early part of lockdown. In fact, it was the week before lockdown. And what happened was this person was essentially an operations director. And for years, his managing director had been trying to encourage him and other people in the business to take on flexible working more. And he'd always been very reticent, been very reserved, and didn't really like it. So when we were chatting, I said, "Oh, how are you? How's it going? You know, this virus seems to be a bit of a problem." And he said, "Well, yeah." He said, "We've just started working from home, and this was before lockdown was compulsory." And I said, "Oh, how are you finding it?" And he said, "Really good, really good." And I said, "Oh, right." I said, "You sound quite sort of surprised." And he said, "I am." He said, and he told me this story about how his managing director had always said, "Look, we want to get people working more flexibly. You know, I want to have sort of hot desking, people coming out of the office, this sort of stuff." And he'd always been against it. And he said, "Do you know what?" He said, "I was wrong, because my people now are much more productive." He said, "I'm finding they're getting a lot more done." So I said to him, "That's interesting." I said, "So what do you think's behind that?" And he sort of chatted a bit more. And I asked him another question. And ultimately, he got to the answer, which is really the truth of the situation. It's about trust. It's all about trust. He didn't trust his people to work from home. Now, we're starting to learn that we can trust people, but we're also still potentially, we have a trapdoor, if you like, with some people where we're not really sure either. But the point is that we have to examine our values as a business as how we're going to go about challenging those behaviours. And actually, are our current values that we have, if we have them, are they appropriate? Are they still appropriate? Or do we need to adapt and change them? Because remember, the behaviour is a living expression of those values. Now, when we move on to attitude and we think about what is possible, I guess, one of the things is it's about how we show up for work. And the majority of people on the call are in a leadership position of some description. And when we talk about managing, there's a big difference between managing, because that's the organisation of people and things, or the direction and organisation of people and things, whereas leadership is something quite different. It's also about basically having everyone aiming in the same direction. It's about success. It's the progressive realisation of a worthy ideal, basically. But we've got to inspire others. It's actually the more human side. So one of the things I'd like you to do is after this call, just reflect upon who's your best ever boss that you've ever had. Maybe you can think of somebody now. And if you write down all the reasons why they were your best boss, it wasn't because they were a great manager. You might have respected them for their technical efficiency or whatever, but actually you'll probably find they were all leadership qualities. It's because they basically were resilient. They basically were somebody who was open-minded, somebody who would listen, somebody who would support, somebody who would challenge you, somebody actually who would encourage you or hold you to account. But all those things were a mindset of their own. They weren't just something that they were parroting out. It's because it was inside them. Now, that's so, so important right now. And the key thing with this is we have to remember that people's habits are essentially hardwired. So we have constructive and non-constructive, productive and non-productive behaviours. They are habitual. So what we've got to start to do is ask ourselves, well, when we think about people working at home now, how can we start to look at think about the kinds of habits that people will potentially fall into that are destructive working from home, or the opposite, the reverse. Okay, so that's something that we've really, really got to think about. And it's absolutely true that successful people form the habit of doing things that failures don't like to do. And this is a big opportunity now for leaders inside the culture, because there is a clear link between the values and the behaviour. Because, as I said before, the behaviour is an expression of the values. So if people aren't behaving in alignment with the values, we need to hold them to account. So therefore, we've got to really spend some time and look at our values and say, are they right? If not, let's go about redefining them, or let's COVIDize them. Let's make them relevant for now. How can we change their meaning? We might not change the statements, because they're probably, if they're written well, there'll be things that you actually really hold true and believe are important. So attitude is going to be absolutely everything. But we've got to understand that some people's attitude is also affected by the fact, as Steve was saying, it's because of some of the things that are going on in their personal circumstances, because they might be worried, they might have financial worries, all these different things. That is all part of a habitual way of thinking too, or it can become that. So we have to provide them with an opportunity to be able to express and talk about these things. Now, this gentleman here is somebody who I trained with, and he basically described attitude. He said it's a combination of your thoughts and your feelings and your actions. And what I'd like you to remember is that we really do have a responsibility as people in a managerial role or in a leadership role, that we cast a shadow. And every institution, if you think about it, is really an extension of the people, the great leaders that form that business. And that is basically something, their character determines the character of the organisation. And again, the same applies for us. So this is very interesting, because when we look at the second question, many of you talked about, well, how are we actually going to engage leaders and managers? And this is really about how are we equipping them, because we can make an assumption that they have all the answers, or that they should just know what to do. But this is equally as troubling for some of them too. So that's another area that we've really, really got to think about and try to bring together. Because this gentleman here, who many of you will know, apologies if you're not a football fan, and apologies if you don't like Man United. I'm not a Man United supporter, but I do love this quote. And he talks about his role was to help people to believe that the impossible was possible. Now, you'll notice I called the presentation The New Possible, or What's Possible, because we keep talking about the new now. But if we're not careful, we're actually also going to get ingrained in a little channel of just thinking that we're restricted. It's not about that. It's about how can we do things differently. And the way in which we're going to be able to do that is basically by keeping going. So this is one of my little hashtags that I use when I'm working with clients sort of one-on-one quite often, and a couple of them have commented on it when I do it. It's about resilience. And resilience is all about that thinking. It's all about how we actually contend with that situation. It's how we choose to process it. It's how we use our power perception. But that's something that we've got to start to do as an organisation, and we've got to basically involve other people. So, choice. It's a choice. All this stuff's a choice. And we've got a choice about whether we take the brave step into actually doing this as well. Because it takes guts for leaders to step out and to address some of these things. Because right now we talk about flow. Flow is where you've got people who essentially, when they're in flow, everything's going well, it's going swimmingly, so the water is just following the rocks in the river. Really what we've got here is our flow's being unsettled. Now, some people might find working from home really, really good. Some people might find that the fact they can change their working pattern really useful. Others may not. Again, though, we've got to open up. We have to be able to create a dialogue with these people so that we can actually start to understand better. So we must never assume, we must ask. And many people are afraid of asking. And here's the key bit. It's a team. We're a team. It doesn't matter whether it's an organisation or whether it's a department or a smaller number of people. It's absolutely about how we approach this. And it's all the things in business, the things that will get us through. Finance is really important at the moment. There's lots of financial worries. I'm not disputing that. But if there's no real discretionary effort from your people and we can't engage those people and get them on the bus, then your chances of survival will be significantly diminished. So this is a wonderful model. Some of you may be familiar with it. If you're not, I encourage you to go and buy this book. It's called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And in this model, we've got, essentially there are 5 layers, and it all starts with us obviously thinking about what do we want to achieve at the top. We've got to think about a team having a definite attention to results. Now there's a distinction here because the book is called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And essentially what we're talking about is a dysfunctional team has an inattention to results. And right now, results aren't just KPIs necessarily. Results could be us working together to find solutions, just even having an agreement that we need to fix something and then focusing on that result. And as far as the trust side is concerned, it all begins here because we have 2 types of trust. We have vulnerable trust and we have predictable trust. Now, predictable trust is almost like, for example, if I was to say to Simon, could you do that for me? And Simon, I know Simon's going to do a great job. That's predictable. I could maybe give, I don't know, another person on the call, I won't name someone because this is a negative slant. It basically I could say, give that to them, and I know they might get it wrong. I can always trust someone to do something one way or another. That's predictable. Now, vulnerability-based trust is the key. And this is so important right now for us when we're building our culture. We have to learn to get vulnerable So McKinsey wrote a report recently in COVID, and they talked about this in there. It's very, very, very true. Essentially, vulnerability-based trust is being able to admit that you're wrong, or you don't know, or you don't have the answer. Apologies for the background noise, someone's just rung the doorbell. But basically what we're talking about here is we've got to learn to make the environment the right one, to make it easy for the people within the team to show some vulnerability so that they can say where they're struggling, or if they've made a mistake, or if they're really contending with something that's difficult because of the current circumstances. But that also counts for the leaders too. And when you do that, you get more traction, because you actually get more trust and respect from the team. So that's one of the key takeaways from today, is we've got to learn about how can we become more vulnerable. The second part of the model is about conflict, and initially this is about healthy debate. So Lencioni uses the word conflict because he intentionally sees it as, he wants it to be seen as people being prepared to go head to head. He doesn't really mean a fight, but he just means a really healthy debate. And essentially, it's not a discussion, it's being able to speak openly and properly about something. Now, this is where the trust comes in. So the whole model is founded on trust. So right now, businesses are being challenged by employees being in different circumstances with different perceptions. And if we can't get to the second stage where we can, at least as a team or as leaders with our people, have healthy conversations where we basically can agree what we're doing, and we might have to agree to disagree along the way. If people hold things back, you haven't got engagement. People aren't actually emotionally involved. You'll get people who will basically deselect themselves. So we don't want that to happen. We don't want politics on the side of it. And the thing that causes politics in teams is a lack of trust. It's an inability to be vulnerable. So once we can get to a point where we can agree, the healthy trust basically breeds a healthy debate, and essentially we're able to commit and support one another in going to where we want to get to, which now, however your business defines that in this period of time, is entirely up to you, of course. But the point is that once you've agreed you're going to do something, we have to make sure that we do it. So we've got to commit. And if it doesn't happen, then essentially we have to hold one another to account. And this is really where your values come in, because your values are essentially, your behaviours, are a living expression of your values. And what happens is that at the time when things aren't done properly or aren't done in the right way, or somebody hasn't behaved in the way that they said they were going to behave, whether they're working at home or whether they're working in a socially distanced office, essentially we have to go back and address that, because if we don't, we're just allowing things to slide. And this is where the model basically takes us back into conflict. And guess what? You can't have a healthy discussion if the trust level is low. So all the opportunities now in culture for businesses in COVID, they're actually not different from what they were before. It's just the same, but you could say that the focus or the volume is actually has been increased. Now, if we're able to do this, we absolutely should be having an attention to results along the way. And that the whole purpose of communication is one of the things that I'm picking up from talking to people is it's the importance of regular communication. Repeat. It also needs to be simple and easy for people to digest. We need to think about the fact that certain people don't process information in the same way as they did. I beg your pardon. Some people process information in different ways from others. Some people might require more of a conversation. Some people might need some time to digest. Some people might be really looking for facts and figures. So some of you, I'm sure, have used behavioural profiling. If you have somebody who's if you're looking at the insights model, a high blue, or in DISC is a high C, then basically those people need facts and information. They're black and white people. So when as leaders we go to them and say we can't give them black and white answers, that causes them distress. It makes them feel uncertain. So we have to think about, if you have behavioural profiles around your business and you're looking at your employees, if you think they're not quite on the bus and they're not quite right, please go back to those profiles and have a look. Because you'll find that certain people's styles, certainly when they're working from home, will be quite different too, in terms of if you're a more social person and you're feeling a little bit more distance because of the fact we're no longer face to face, we've got to understand that that's actually oxygen for those people. The fact that they're not getting that, pardon the phrase, skin to skin contact, you'll get what I mean by that. Basically, that to them it's a real sort of demerit in this process for them. It's something that's demotivating. So we've got to think about our communication style, but more importantly, it's the communication needs of the people that we're dealing with. How do they want to hear and reference information? So, and also we've got people who potentially, if back to behavioural profiling again, but if they're a green in the insights model, for example, or an S in the DISC model, those people, they definitely need time to digest things. They like stability. So this for them is very, very unsettling. So perhaps you can target those employees or those team members and to talk to them about it and actually use their profile as almost as a tool to have that kind of conversation, to open them up. Now, how do elephants listen? I'm going to look at the chat because I've been looking up here. How does an elephant listen? Obvious answers are allowed. With its ears. Yeah, of course it does. No, it doesn't. Well, it does, and it doesn't. So the really interesting thing is that elephants have got really, really big feet. And of course, they've got big ears, and we have to use our ears. Of course we do. So we talk about, I don't know if some of you were on the sales club call the other week, and Jonathan Finch was talking about using your mouth and your ears in the 20 and 80% ratio, which is absolutely true. And that's when you're selling. Well, if you think about it, selling is actually what you're doing when you're coaching or leading an individual too. So we actually need to be listening 80% and saying 20%. So our ears are important, of course they are, but an elephant listens with its feet too. If you research it, an elephant can actually sense people or movement from kilometers away, and we're talking a lot. Okay, it's the seismic, they can feel the seismic vibration. And that's why their feet are so big, the pads. Now, that's interesting because I used to use this to say to leaders, do you walk the floor? So this is before COVID. How often do you get out of your desk? If you're in a factory, do you go around the factory? Do you talk to people? Are you present? Are you visible? Okay. Now, that begs a question. How can we be visible now when we're actually not seeing one another because the forced program of turning up to work and going into the same building isn't happening in the same way? So one of the things to consider is how can we come up with a way in which we can be more visible? How are you going to walk the floor virtually? Is it phone calls? Is it Zoom? I know plenty of you have been doing lots of great things with these sorts of things, doing quizzes and fun hours and all these sorts of things. But what about the one-on-one stuff? Think about what I was saying earlier. Because out of sight is out of mind for some people. And actually, we've got to remember that certain people actually might feel like they're actually out of sight and out of mind themselves when they'd quite like to be heard or given the opportunity to speak, because they might feel uncomfortable speaking up. So we want to make it easy for people to do that. So all of this boils down to standards. And when we think about standards, I like to use the analogy of a band. So when we think about a band playing a concert, what is it that we go to a concert to listen to? Music? Yep. A crowd? Maybe. Atmosphere? Yeah. All of these things. So those are all things. But actually what we go to, we actually want to hear good music. We need the music to be in time. So the band are the leaders. They are the managers. We need them to be in sync. And the main lead singer is essentially the most senior leader. Now, if you go to a concert and you're really looking forward to it, and you've got this, you're so excited about going, you're going to see your favorite band, and then they're out of tune, or it's not quite right, it just doesn't quite cut it. And what you really want, the crowd of the team, they're the wider team, they're the wider business. We want them applauding. We want them saying more, more. So right now, the way in which the band plays actually has changed. So we've got to learn, essentially the leaders are being asked to pick up new instruments too. And what we've got to make sure is that we're effectively, as a business, agreeing how we're going to go about this. So if you haven't already sat down as a management team or as a leadership team and discussed what your communication strategy is going to be, then absolutely you should, without question. Now, what are people looking for? At an individual level, this is kind of where they're at. So from speaking to people that I've been talking to throughout the last 3 or 4 months, when I talk to individual leaders or team members, these are the kinds of things that they basically are saying that they feel like they need. Interestingly, one person has been talking to me about the fact that they feel that working from home has made it really hard for them to be accountable for what they're doing. That's really interesting, isn't it? When you think about, well, what's their leader or their manager doing about that? Resilience. It's about having the right mindset and being able to do that. But actually, they need some sounding boards. They need to be able to talk to people. So this is kind of, when I put this up here, this is my own take really on the kinds of conversations that I'm having with people. However, that's the role of the manager or the leader too. So it's something that we need to bear in mind. Now, when we go back to the 5 behaviours principles, these are all the things that right now I've had 2 inquiries within the last 2 weeks. And it's really interesting that the focus has been senior leadership teams who are starting to crack. They're starting to feel amongst themselves, they're starting to feel that there is some tension there. And actually, it all boils down to the fact that the trust level isn't high enough. Because if the trust level was high enough, they would be able to do many of the positive things that you can see on here. But it's not happening as well as it should. So essentially, what we're really saying is that if you're running a team yourself, think about how you can encourage many of these words that you can see on the screen. So it's, how can you start to encourage people to open up, to listen to one another, so that we can actually get some open communication going, so that they basically can be confident enough to share an opinion, or to even be vulnerable, basically, so that they can say how they feel about things with no risk of any agenda. So Steve mentioned I think when in his slide, he was talking about the fact that a lot of people are worried about being able to speak up about the consequences of saying something, because they might lose their job, or whistleblowing and all these different sorts of things. So we've really got to try and make it the case that people understand that this is now a situation that we've got to develop a purpose for taking responsibility for one another. And it's not about blame and excuses. Absolutely, it's not. So in other words, it's a positive mental attitude, and that's the right mental attitude. And in order for you to essentially transform your people, your teams, and your business to be the best that they can be, it's super important that you have your own clarity. So that's your own inner game, first of all. But actually for the wider business. So this, talking about the quest and finding clarity and the ethos, this is all about looking at things again, looking forward, and actually trying to create that new fresh sense of purpose, to encourage people to get on the bus so they believe there's a clear path to follow. Now, if you can't tell them that that's the case, then you've got to be honest with them about that, and I'll come to that shortly. And then confidence. It's about actually doing what's required, and it's about learning to take risks and actually helping people to take risks. And I'm not talking about necessarily about the health and safety side of this, although that will be the case for some people when the circumstances have been there, the situation has been laid out, or the guidelines are being followed. There are opportunities to encourage certain people to have a little bit more confidence, but it's not about that. This is really about going, right, you know what, we are here to survive. This is keeping going. This is making sure the business survives. And it's about doing what's required. It's having confidence in that. And then very much we've got to believe, we've got to have resilience, we've got to have faith it's going to happen, and we've got to believe in ourselves. And interestingly, when we develop those trust elements and we learn to be able to create a proper healthy debate, that is essentially one of the big outgrowths, because all of a sudden we start to get to know, like, and trust one another in a different way. So here are some tips. Excuse me. Concentrate on the facts. So what I mean by that is when you're talking about something, and Emma touched on some of these things earlier too, you have to concentrate on what the actual facts are. And we have to be able to acknowledge uncertainty, all right? Now, if you can provide context or to a situation and provide criteria that people can understand, that will help. But also we've got to be transparent. So if we think that we're unable to give an answer, then we have to say what we are doing and what we're trying to do, but actually we're being honest and truthful about that, okay? Now, that really means we have to be able to be vulnerable, and we've got to be able to share, decide when's the right time to be vulnerable. So we've got to share carefully. However, apologies for somebody at the front door again, the joys of working from home. We've got to learn when is the right time and when is perhaps not the right time. So we've got to show a little bit of emotional intelligence about that. But being vulnerable is important. Now, we've got to connect to that new purpose. And as part of that, we have to help people to realise that there are realistic goals that they can achieve to work towards that. And keep repeating your messages. So it's repeat, repeat, repeat. You cannot do it enough, but do it in different ways. Think about how different people from different parts of the business can deliver that for you in different ways too. Is it a town hall that's disseminated and then we have lots of other people inside there? So essentially you have one message, the same message is then replayed again, but in a different way for the team. And then maybe inside team members. So it's essentially something that we've got to think about. How can we say the same thing, but in different ways through different mechanisms, really? And most importantly, all of this really, really is founded on you asking more questions and listening and then taking action, even though you might not be able to give people exactly what they want, because they certainly won't follow if you're going to do nothing. And if you can't do anything, you've got to be honest with them. So here's a checklist. First question, how well do your mission, vision and values stand up right now? So that's a question to ask yourself, because so many of the things that, that this is all founded on lives in there. If you've never done this work before, it's really, really important anyway, because remember, the 4 key enablers have been around and they will continue to be around. It doesn't matter whether it's COVID or not. Which area of your business needs the most attention? Get focused. All right. The problem right now is we hear Boris Johnson talking about whack-a-mole with trying to kill the virus in certain regions and one thing or another when we have outbreaks. But we've all got outbreaks in our business in lots of different ways, in different areas. And it almost seems like sometimes there may be too many. But actually, let's prioritize. Let's work out where the quickest wins are. Where's the lowest hanging fruit? And which one's going to have the biggest impact? So what's going to have the most value, the biggest impact, and very importantly, you can apply. And then how good's your leadership and management behaviours? So are we just managing or are we leading? So are we just organising and directing people and things? Or are we actually taking on the responsibility of being a leader? And remember, success is the progressive realisation of a worthy ideal. It doesn't matter if you've not got to your goal immediately. If you're, by definition, if you're moving forward towards a goal, you're a success. Even if you might feel like you're going backwards, that's just part of the process. So how can you involve your teams more to create the possible? This is so important and really does link back into the first stage particularly. And you'll find out more about what needs attention as well if you engage and communicate with your teams better. And then finally, how are you going to keep your finger on the pulse of how your people... Now remember, this is at all levels. So we can make a really big sweeping comment here that leaders are all fine. No. The managers are all fine. No. We're all having to contend with this in different ways. But how are you going to decide? What's your strategy going to be for getting your finger on the pulse of that? Because the more consistent you are in having a read of how the different layers of your business are thinking and feeling about the situation, it will be easier for you to address and have the conversations that you need to have to unearth the solutions. So essentially, that's just a little checklist for you. And if anyone wants to get in touch and ask me any questions, please do. I'm really sorry about the technical problems. It's been frustrating. It's the first time that's happened to me for months, literally, doing this all the time. So thank you. And I'm happy to open up to questions.
Thanks, Andrew. It's a mark of a pro who can not allow themselves to get rocked and unsettled by those tech problems and deliver that with the cool, calm assuredness that you did. So thank you and well done.
Thanks,
has anyone got any questions for Andrew? I think because we've got a relatively small number on, we've got 21 on. So if you want to just unmute yourself and put your question direct, we'll be happy for you to do that. Okay.
Silence, as they say in French.
That's either a really good thing. I mean, it could be. You've just answered all the questions already, Andrew. So
Well, maybe. I mean, I'd happily pose some questions myself to the audience. So, in terms of where you are right now, are there any things that you feel you have already been doing? I'm sure quite a few of these things you've already been doing, or which particular areas have you been finding the most challenging?
Andrew, I'll say something, Andrew and Simon. I think one of the biggest challenges that I've had, and I think people have this a lot, is not necessarily knowing when I can interrupt people. I know that people often feel like that with me when we are busy churning through lots and lots of client inquiries, to find the time just to check in with people, rather than it being a prescribed, right, we are having one-to-ones. And I suppose it's just, if there are any tips really as to, particularly whilst we're still working mainly remotely, how to kind of judge or try and pop that kind of time in. It's a lot easier in the office. I'm in the office today and it's been great because there are a few people in, and whilst we're all busy, we've kind of been able to gauge who's got that moment just for a quick catch up, even if it's just for a bit of a chin wag over making a brew.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when we're in an office, we can have impromptu conversations with people, and quite often I think for many people, they're realizing that we relied on those sorts of things quite a lot in the past, and now this has changed that. But actually, I think under the surface, I don't think it's actually the rules of engagement haven't necessarily changed, because I went through the Zoom fatigue thing, a few months ago, and I took the decision that I would use the telephone more. So I asked myself now, should I use Zoom or should I use the phone? And when I called people at the beginning, they actually were saying how refreshing it was to use the telephone, and that they actually liked it. So what's the difference between just picking the phone up and just ringing somebody, and if they're free, they're free? What's the difference between that and just going and knocking on the door in their office and going and chatting with them? I think the other thing is that Zoom has made things a little bit more, perhaps made some of the interactions feel a little bit more whilst it's kind of informal because we're at home, it also makes it a bit more formal. So, and I think the other thing, Emma, is really, to be honest, I think it's being brave enough to say to the person, look, how would you like to keep in touch? It's letting them know that you want to keep in touch that's important, and then making sure that you allow that to happen. And if they go, well, no, I'm fine, okay, that's okay up to a point, but then you've got to say, no, come on, if that's the case, I think we need to just make sure that we do have some sort of regular check-in. But I know there are clients that I'm working with who's, some of their team are saying, well, you know what, I'd much rather that you just give me a call and ring me in the evening, or because their working day has become more flexible as well. So I think I really genuinely think it's about talking to people, and what's the preferred method. It's also different modes of communication as well. Some people prefer to perhaps use WhatsApp or whatever. Ask is one of the things, definitely.
Thank you. That's great.
Thanks. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Andrew. I'll take one last question from Louise and then we'll wrap it up because it's midday now. So, Louise, do you want to put your question to Andrew?
Yeah, thanks. It's more of a point really along the theme that Emma just made. I find it difficult working from home and everyone being remote, because I've realised I use visual clues quite a lot in the way I manage the team, or make sure everyone's on the same page and and is happy, and whether they need any help. And I really struggle trying to find a way of continuing to communicate with everybody without being able to see them. So I'm opposite to you, Andrew. I prefer Zoom or Teams, because I'd much rather look at somebody's face and speak to them rather than just speak to them on the phone. But it was about asking them, because I was really concerned that I wasn't communicating often enough with my team and keeping them together as a team. When I asked them the question, do you think we're doing this often enough, and is this the right format, they were all, yeah, that's fine, we don't need any more than what we're giving you. So it was more about asking that question and not just presuming, and I was kind of putting my preferences onto everybody else. But it has been a very odd situation for us to be in, and I think it's going to take some time to continue to work through it as we start to change the way we work going forward.
Yeah, I agree, Louise, and I think one of the things that's interesting inside all of this is also when you look at great engagement work, you think about reward and recognition. Keyword is recognition, and I think sometimes it's a little bit, it's quite easy to do informal recognition when you're all in the same place, and I think it's finding different ways to do that too. And whereas you might not necessarily think to send somebody a message or whatever, but there's one thing that I definitely would say now, and it's the power, and it's always been there, but as the digital age gets stronger and stronger, the power of the handwritten note. Send people cards. Send them a note to tell them that you appreciate what they've done, because that will really, really resonate and let them know that, you know, that they're being recognised for what they're doing, and it's more personal. So there's lots of different little things that we can do, and I think it's back to asking, isn't it? It's interesting that your take was different, and I think what I was saying earlier about behavioural profiling is very interesting. If those of you who've got that resource in your business, definitely look at that and to think about what does that actual behavioural style mean for that individual and how they prefer to be communicated with, or by how, sorry. Still didn't find the right word.
Thanks, Louise. Thank you, Andrew. And thanks to everyone for bearing with us during our little technical hiccups. The YouTube video will be seamless though. It'll all be edited out and it'll be amazing when it hits YouTube.
Oh, I've given you so much work to do, Simon.
Not me, chaff. Fine. Just to wrap up, I want to thank Forbes Solicitors, our sponsors of the HR Forum. Thank you to Emma for her introduction and useful insight and reflection on what's current in the HR world. Thank you to Andrew, as I said, for not letting that rocky start with the tech floor him, and for delivering his presentation with such authority and style. Very grateful, Andrew. If I had more resource and more time, I'd send you a handwritten note. Really do appreciate it. And thank you to Steve Smith as well for his cameo. The next ChamberLIVE is next Wednesday at 10:30. You can find all the details at chamberlive.co.uk, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday afternoon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.